Okay, you're back for Chapter 10 in The Silver Chair. Chapter 10 is called Travels Without the Sun. Now, do you remember what happened in Chapter 9 at the end of it? It was a little bit tense. The three of them, Jill, Scrub, and Puddleglum, were in the house of the giants, and then they discovered that the giants were going to have a feast with them, the main entree. So they had to figure out how to escape, and they got outside the castle. They found a little hole in this rock steps, I think, and they crawled through there, and then they blocked off the hole so the giants couldn't see, and then it was pitch black in there. So they started walking along, holding hands in the pitch black, until all of a sudden they slid down some rough slide kind of a thing, and rocks and that there, and they thumped to the bottom, and they were a little bit dazed. Nothing hurt, but they couldn't see a thing. And then suddenly what happened? They heard a voice, didn't they? A pitch black voice that said, "What make you here, creatures of the overworld?" So Chapter 10, Travels Without the Sun. Who's there?" shouted the three travelers. "I am the warden of the marches of Underland, and with me stand 100 Earthmen in arms," came the reply. "Tell me, quickly, who you are, and what is your errand in the deep realm?" "Well, we actually fell down by accident," said Puddleglum truthfully enough. "Many fall down, and few return to the sunlit lands," said the voice. "Make ready now to come with me to the Queen of the Deep Realm." What does she want with us?" asked Scrub cautiously. "I do not know," said the voice. "Her will is not to be questioned, but obeyed." While he said these words, there was a noise like a soft explosion, and immediately a cold light that was gray with a little blue in it flooded the cavern suddenly. All hope that the speaker had been idly boasting when he spoke of his 100 armed followers, all those hopes died at once. Jill found herself blinking and staring at a dense crowd. They were of all sizes, from little gnomes that were barely a foot high, that's how tall they were, to stately figures that were taller than men. All of them carried three-pronged spears in their hands, and they were all dreadfully pale. That means very light-colored, no tan at all on their face, and they all stood just as still as statues. Apart from that, they were really quite different. Some had tails and others didn't. Some wore great beards, and others had very round, smooth faces, like big as pumpkins. There were long, pointed noses and long, soft noses, like small trunks, like an elephant might have or something, and great blobby noses. Several had single horns in the middle of their forehead. But in one respect, they were all alike. Every face in that whole 100 was just as sad as a face could be. They were so sad that after the first glance, Jill almost forgot to be afraid of them. She felt like she would like to cheer them up somehow. "Well," said Puddleglum, rubbing his hands, "this is just what I needed. If these chaps don't teach me how to take a serious view of life, I don't know what will." Puddleglum. "Look at that fellow with the walrus mustache, or that one with it." "Get up," said the leader of the Earthmen. Well, there was nothing else to be done. The three travelers scrambled to their feet and joined hands. One really wanted to touch a friend's hand in a moment like this. And the Earthmen came all around them, padding on large, soft feet, of which some had 10 toes, some had 12, and others no toes at all. "March," said the warden, and so march they did. The cold light came from a large ball on the top of a long pole, and the tallest of the gnomes carried this at the head of the procession, at the very front. By its cheerless rays, they could see that they were in a natural cavern. The walls and roof were all knobbily twisted and gashed into 1,000 fantastic shapes, and the stony floor sloped downward as they proceeded. It was worse for Jill than for the others because, well, she hated dark underground places, closed-in places. And when, as they went on, the cave got lower and narrower, and when at last the light bearer stood aside, and the gnomes, one by one, stooped down. Well, all except for the smallest one. They stooped and stepped into a little dark crack and disappeared. Oh, poor Jill felt that she could bear it no longer. I can't go in there. I can't. I won't, she panted. The Earthmen said nothing, but they all lowered their spears and pointed them at her. Steady, Pole, said Puddleglum. Those big fellows wouldn't be crawling in there if it didn't get wider later on. And, well, there's one thing about this underground work. We shan't get any rain. Oh, but you don't understand. I can't, said Jill. Well, think how I felt on that cliff, Pole, said Scrub. So here's what we'll do. You go first, Puddleglum, then Jill, and I'll come right after her. That's right, said the Marshwiggle, getting down on its hands and knees. You keep a grip on my heels, Pole, and Scrub will hold on to yours. Then we'll all be comfortable. Comfortable, said Jill. But she did get down, and they crawled in on their elbows. It was a nasty place. You had to go flat on your face for, well, it seemed like half an hour. It might really have only been 5 minutes, though, and it was hot. Jill felt like she was being smothered, but at last a dim light showed ahead of them. Then the tunnel grew wider and higher, and they finally came out hot, dirty, and shaken into a cave that was so large it scarcely seemed like a cave at all. It was full of a dim, drowsy radiance, so that here they had no need of the Earthmen's strange lantern. The floor was soft with some kind of moss, and out of this grew many strange shapes that were branched and tall like trees, but more flabby like mushrooms. I don't know if you can picture that. They stood too far apart to make a forest. It was more like a park. The light, which was now greenish-gray, seemed to come from both them and from the moss. It wasn't strong enough to reach the roof of the cave, though, which must have been a long, long way overhead. Across the mild, soft, sleepy place they were now made to march. It was very sad, but with, I guess, a quiet sort of sadness, like soft music. Here they passed dozens of strange animals lying on the turf. They were either dead or asleep. Jill couldn't tell which. These were mostly of a dragonish or bat-like sort of animal. Puddleglum didn't know what any of them were. Do these grow here? Scrub asked the warden. He seemed very surprised at being spoken to, the warden did, but he replied, no, they are all beasts that have found their way down by chasms and caves out of overland and into the deep realm. Many come down and few return to the sunlit lands. It is said that they will all wake at the end of the world. Then his mouth shut like a box when he'd said this. And in the great silence of that cave, the children felt that they wouldn't dare speak again. The bare feet of the gnomes were padding on the deep moss, made no sound. There was no wind, no birds, no sound of running water, no sound of breathing from the strange beasts. It's very quiet. When they had walked for several miles, they came to a wall of rock, and in it a low archway leading into another cavern. It was not, however, so bad as the last entrance, and Jill could go through it without bending her head. It brought them into a smaller cave, long and narrow, about the shape and size of a cathedral, which is still pretty big if you ask me, if you've ever been inside a cathedral. And here, filling almost the whole length of it, lay an enormous man who was fast asleep. He was far bigger than any of the giants they'd seen, and his face was not at all like a giant's. It was noble and beautiful. His breast rose, his chest rose and fell gently under the snowy beard, so you can tell he's breathing. His beard covered him to the waist. A pure silver light. No one could see where it came from, but it rested upon him. Who is that? Asked Puddleglum, and it was so long since anyone had spoken that Jill wondered how he had the nerve to say anything. "That is old Father Time, who once was a king in Overland," said the warden, "and now he is sunk down into the deep realm and lies dreaming of all the things that are done in the upper world. Many sink down, and few return to the sunlit lands. They say he will wake at the end of the world." And then out of that cave they passed into another, and then into another, and so on, until Jill lost count of how many caves they'd been through. But always they were going downhill. And each cave was lower than the last cave they'd been in, till the very thought of the weight and depth of the earth above you was suffocating if you thought about it. At last they came to a place where the warden commanded his cheerless lantern to be lit again. Then they passed into a cave that was so wide and so dark that they could see nothing of it except that was right in front of them, a strip of pale sand that ran down into still water. And there, beside a little jetty, lay a ship without mast or sail, but with many oars. They were made to go on board her and led forward to the bows, that's the front of the ship if you remember, to the bows where there was a clear space in front of the rowers' benches, and there was a seat running around inside the bulwarks. "One thing I'd like to know," said Puddleglum, "is whether anyone from our world, from up atop I mean, has ever done this trip before." "Many have taken ship at the Pale Bleaches," replied the warden, "and yes, I know," interrupted Puddleglum, "and few return to the sunlit lands. You needn't say it again. You are a chap of one idea, aren't you?" The children huddled close together on each side of Puddleglum. They had thought him a wet blanket while they were still above ground, but down here he seemed the only comforting thing they had. Then the pale lantern was hung up amidships, and the earthmen all sat down to the oars, and the ship began to move. The lantern cast its light only a very short way ahead. Looking ahead, they could see nothing but smooth, dark water fading into absolute blackness. "Oh, whatever will become of us?" said Jill despairingly. "Now, don't let your spirits down, Pole," said the Marshwiggle. "There's one thing we've got to remember. We are back on the right lines. We were to go under the ruined city, and, well, here we are under it. We're following the instructions again, Aslan's instructions." Presently they were given food, flat, flabby cakes of some sort, which hardly had any taste, and after that they gradually fell asleep, but when they woke up everything was just the same as when they'd gone to sleep. The gnomes were still rowing, the ship was still gliding forward, still dead blackness ahead. After that, how often they woke and slept and ate and slept again and woke and slept and ate. None of them could ever remember. And the worst thing about it was that, well, you started to almost feel as if you'd always lived on that ship, in that darkness. And you started to wonder whether sun and blue skies and wind and birds hadn't only been just a dream. They'd almost given up hoping or being afraid about anything when at last they saw lights ahead, dreary lights like that of their own lantern. Then quite suddenly one of those lights came close and they saw that they were passing another ship. After that they met several ships. Then, staring still till their eyes hurt, they saw that some of the lights ahead were shining on what looked like wharfs, walls, towers, and moving crowds, but still there was hardly any noise. "By Jove," said Scrub, "it's a city!" And soon they all saw that he was right. But what a strange city. The lights were so few and far apart that they would hardly have done for cottages in our world, but the little bits of the place which you could see by the lights were like glimpses of a great seaport city. You could make out in one place a whole crowd of ships loading or unloading into another, bales of stuff and warehouses. In a third, walls and pillars that suggested great palaces or temples, and always, wherever the light fell, endless crowds. hundreds of earthmen jostling one another as they padded softly about their business in narrow streets, broad squares, or up great flights of steps. Their continued movement made a sort of soft murmuring noise as the ship drew nearer and nearer, but there was no songs or shouts or no bell to hear or the rattle of a wheel anywhere. The city was, well, it was as quiet and nearly as dark as the inside of of an anthill must be. At last their ship was brought alongside a quay and made fast, tied up with ropes. The three travelers were taken ashore and marched up into the city. Crowds of earthmen, no two were alike, rubbed shoulders with them in the crowded streets, and the sad light fell on many sad and grotesque faces, but no one showed any interest at all in the strangers. Every gnome seemed to be just as busy as it was sad. Although Jill never found what they were busy about, you couldn't really tell. But the endless moving, shoving, hurrying, and the soft pad, 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 pad of their feet went on. At last they came to what appeared to be a great castle, although a few of the windows in it were lighted. Very few, not many. Here they were taken in and made to cross a courtyard and to climb many staircases. This brought them in the end to a great murkily lit room. But in one corner of it, oh joy, there was an archway filled with quite a different sort of light. It was the honest, yellowish, warm sort of light such as the lamps humans use. What showed by this light inside the archway was the foot of a staircase which wound upward between walls of stone. The light seemed to be coming from the top. Two earthmen stood, one on each side of the arch, like sentries or footmen. The warden went up to these two and said, as if it were a password, "Many sink down to the underworld, and few return to the sunlit lands," they answered, as if it were the countersign of the password. Then all three put their heads together and talked. At last one of the two gnomes in waiting said, "I tell you, the Queen's Grace is gone from hence on her great affair. We had best keep these top dwellers in strait prison till her homecoming. Few return to the sunlit lands." Well, at that moment the conversation was interrupted by what seemed to Jill the most delightful noise in the world. It came from above, from the top of the staircase, and it was a clear, ringing, perfectly human voice. It was the voice of a young man. "What coil are you keeping down there, Mulligatharum?" it shouted. "Overworlders! Ha! Bring them up to me, and that presently." "Please it your highness to remember," began Mulligatharum, but the voice cut him short. It pleases my highness principally to be called obeyed. It pleases my highness principally to be obeyed, old mutterer. Bring them up," it called. Mulligatharum shook his head, motioned to the travelers to follow, and began going up the staircase. At every step the light increased. There were rich tapestries hanging on the walls. The lamplight shone golden through thin curtains at the staircase head. The earthmen parted the curtains and stood aside. The three passed in. They were in a beautiful room, richly tapestried, with a bright fire on a clean hearth, and red wine and cut glass sparkling on the table. A young man with fair hair, like blonde kind of hair, rose to greet them. He was handsome and looked both bold and kind, though there was something about his face that didn't seem quite right. He was dressed in black and altogether looked a little bit like Hamlet, if you know any of the Shakespeare stories. "Welcome, overworlders," he cried. "But stay a moment, I cry you mercy. I have seen you two fair children, and this your strange governor. I saw you before. Was it not you three that met me by the bridge on the borders of Ettinsmuir when I rode there by my lady's side?" "Oh, you were the Black Knight who never spoke," exclaimed Jill. "And was that lady, was she the Queen of Underland?" asked Puddleglum in no very friendly voice. And Scrub, who was thinking the very same thing, burst out, "Because if it was, I think she was jolly mean to send us off to a castle of giants who intended to eat us. What harm had we ever done her, I should like to know?" "How?" said the Black Knight with a frown. "If you were not so young a warrior, boy, you and I might have fought to death on this quarrel. I can hear no words against my lady's honor. But of this you may be assured, that whatever she said to you, she said of good intent. You do not know her. She is a nosegay of all virtues, as truth, mercy, constancy, gentleness, courage, and the rest. I say what I know. Her kindness to me alone, who can in no way reward her, would make an admirable history. But you shall know and love her hereafter. Meanwhile, what is your errand in the deep lands?" And before Puddleglum could stop her, Jill blurted out, "Please, we are trying to find Prince Rilian of Narnia." And then she realized what a frightful risk she had taken. These people might be enemies, but the knight showed no interest at all in what she said. "Rilian, Narnia," he said carelessly. "Narnia? What land is that? I've never heard the name. It must be a 1,000 leagues from these parts of the overworld that I know, but it was a strange fantasy that brought you seeking this. How do you call him? Billion? Trillion? In my lady's realm? Indeed, to my certain knowledge, there is no such man here." He laughed very loudly at this, and Jill thought to herself, I wonder, is that what's wrong with her face? Is he a bit silly? "We had been told to look for a message on the stones of the city ruinous," said Scrub, "and we saw the words, 'Under me.'" The knight laughed even more heartily than before. "You were the more deceived," he said. "Those words meant nothing to your purpose. Had you but asked my lady, she could have given you better counsel. For those words are all that is left of a longer script, which in ancient times, as she well remembers, expressed this verse. Though under earth and throneless now I be, yet while I lived, all earth was under me." From which it is plain that some great king of the ancient giants who lies buried there caused this boast to be cut in the stone over top of his grave. Though the breaking up of some stones and the carrying away of others for new buildings and the filling up of the cuts with rubble and has left only those two words that can still be read. Is it not the merriest jest in the world, a really funny joke, that you should have thought that they were written for you? This was like cold water poured down the back to Scrub and Jill, for it seemed to them very likely that the words had nothing to do with their quest at all, and that they'd been taken in by a mere accident. Was their whole trip a waste of time so far? "Don't you mind," said Puddleglum. "There are no accidents. Our guide is Aslan, and he was there when the giant king caused the letters to be cut, and he knew already all things that would come of them, including this. This guide of yours must be a long liver, friend," said the knight with another of his laughs. Jill began to find his laughing a little bit irritating. "And it seems to me, sir," answered Puddleglum, "that this lady of yours must be a long liver too, if she remembers the verse as it was when they first cut it." "Very shrewd, Frogface," said the knight, clapping Puddleglum on the shoulder and laughing again. "And you have hit the truth. She is of divine race, and knows neither age nor death. I am the more thankful to her for all her infinite bounty to such a poor mortal wretch as I. For you must know, sir, I am a man under most strange afflictions, and none but the Queen's grace would have had patience with me." "Patience," said I, "but it goes far beyond that. She has promised me a great kingdom in Overland, and when I am king, her own most gracious hand in marriage. But the tale is too long for you to hear while fasting and standing. Hi there, some of you. Bring wine and updwellers' food for my guests. Please you, be seated, gentlemen. Little maiden, sit in this chair. You shall hear it all." And that's the end of chapter 10. Chapter 11 is called In the Dark Castle. I'll see you then.